What's up fam, we're back with the 9th patch of the year. We've got a ton of updates for you today, let's get right into it. Before we dive into the champion changes, I'd like to let you know that the upgraded arena mode is out on PvE with a new map, prismatic items, additions, and augments. It will now have 16 players instead of 8 and is set to go live between May 1st and 3rd. Now on to champions with minor changes. This patch includes a lot of nerfs. Late game champs like Aurelion Sol, Twitch, Kassadin, and Jinx have been nerfed, along with Talia, Urgot, and Master Yi, but Seraphine gets a simple ratio buff to her Q. As always, let's get on with champion buffs. Amumu gets a buff to his base armor and AD. Kenan's stop motion and his ult has been removed, now he'll be able to cast combos with his ult, nice and smooth. Sejuani gets a buff to her passive and W damage. As for her W1 is a buff, gaining more base damage and percent health damage, but her W2 is essentially a nerf until late game. Malzahar gets buffed early game to his Q's mana cost and E's cooldown. Karma's Q gets a slow rate buff, and her mantra E's movement speed and shield for allies get a small percentage buff as well. Moving on to champion nerfs, you knew this was coming sooner or later and now it's here. The only OP mid champ as of now, Auri gets a base damage nerf on her W and a cooldown nerf on her ult. Olaf's base damage on his Q, armor, and MR stats on his ult will be nerfed but will be compensated with buffs to damage on monsters. Evelynn gets quite the significant nerf. Slowdown rate on her W and the AP ratio on her ultimate have been nerfed, which will affect both early and late game. Pyke gets nerfed on his W's cooldown and mana cost. Blitzcrank's shield duration on his passive and W movement speed have been nerfed to a fairly sizable extent. Okay, now we're on to champion adjustments. Bel'Veth's bonus attack speed per stack and damage to monsters get buffed, but her Q's AD ratio gets nerfed by 10%. Janna gets nerfed on her W's base damage and ratio, but gets compensated with a buff to her E's shield amount. Akshan's Q damage to non-champions will be reduced, his Q's movement speed will be fixed at 20%, his ult gets buffed on base damage and AD ratio, but the lost health damage ratio decreases by 1%. Neela gets an adjustment on her Q skill, the AD ratio and bonus damage per crit chance get nerfed, but additional attack speed will increase late game. Finally, item changes. Bad news for bruisers. Eclipse and Sundered Sky are finally getting nerfed. Death Dance, Hex Drinker, and Moz recipes have changed and get adjustments to their stats. And that concludes today's patch. Thank you for sticking around. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.